My entitled cousin inherited 700K and mocked me. Enjoy being poor. He gloated. I just smiled knowing he had no idea how to manage money. 8 months later, he was screaming at my door, broke and betrayed after losing it all. 8 months ago, my life changed in the most unexpected way. Not because something great happened to me, but because I got to witness the most spectacular financial implosion I've ever seen in real life. It started at my grandmother's funeral. The whole family had gathered, and honestly, most of us were there more out of obligation than genuine grief. Grandma had been sick for years, and her passing, while sad, wasn't exactly shocking. What was shocking was what happened after the will reading. My cousin had always been the golden child. 3 years older than me, he'd coasted through life on charm and family connections. While I'd worked my way through community college and then state school, scraping together money for textbooks and living off ramen, he'd gotten a business degree from an expensive private university that his parents paid for in full. While I'd been grinding away at entry-level jobs, building my resume and learning actual skills, he'd been handed management positions at companies where his father had connections. The thing about my cousin that always grated on me wasn't just his privilege, it was how he wore it. He never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how much better he was doing than the rest of us. Family gatherings were his personal stage for showing off his latest expensive purchase or bragging about his salary. So when the lawyer announced that my grandmother had left her entire estate, worth about $700,000, to my cousin, I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, maybe, but not surprised. What did surprise me was his reaction afterward. As we filed out of the lawyer's office, my cousin pulled me aside. He had this smirk on his face that I'd seen 1,000 times before, usually right before he said something designed to make me feel small. He told me how sorry he felt for me, having to work so hard for so little. He said he'd always felt bad watching me struggle while everything came so easily to him. Then he delivered the line that would stick with me for months. He told me to enjoy being poor while he enjoyed being rich. I just smiled and congratulated him on his inheritance. What else was I going to do? Make a scene at Grandma's funeral? But as I drove home that day, something was bothering me beyond just his usual arrogance. There was something different about the way he'd acted, something more desperate and cruel than usual. That's when it hit me. I'd been so focused on resenting his success that I'd never actually looked closely at what that success really entailed. I started thinking about the last few family gatherings, replaying conversations in my head. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that for all his bragging, my cousin had never actually demonstrated any real understanding of money management, investment, or even basic financial planning. His expensive lifestyle wasn't the result of smart financial decisions. It was just the result of having access to family money and credit. Every story he told about his business successes was vague and filled with buzzwords. Every expensive purchase he showed off was financed rather than bought outright. I began to suspect that despite his impressive salary and family connections, my cousin was probably leveraged to the hilt and living paycheck to paycheck, just like everyone else. Except his paychecks were bigger and his credit limits were higher. The inheritance represented a massive windfall, but it also represented something potentially dangerous. A huge amount of money in the hands of someone who had never had to be truly responsible with money before. I decided to keep an eye on things, not out of malice, but out of genuine curiosity. Would he prove me wrong? Would he invest wisely and set himself up for life? Or would he do exactly what I suspected he would do? Update 1. I didn't have to wait long to get my answer. Within 2 weeks of receiving the inheritance, my cousin had quit his job. He announced this at a family barbecue, explaining that he was going to take some time to explore his options and invest in himself. When my uncle asked him about his plans, my cousin launched into this elaborate explanation about cryptocurrency investments and day trading. He'd apparently been watching YouTube videos and reading forums, and he was convinced he could turn his $700,000 into millions within a year. Several family members tried to suggest he talk to a financial advisor, maybe invest more conservatively, but he brushed off their concerns. He insisted he'd done his research and knew what he was doing. He even made a few jokes about how people who worked traditional jobs just didn't understand modern wealth building. Over the next few months, the family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable. My cousin would show up in expensive clothes and accessories, talking about his investments and his portfolio. He bought a luxury car, not a sensible luxury car, but a high-end sports car with a monthly payment that would have covered my rent for 3 months. He moved out of his apartment and into an expensive downtown loft. He started dating a woman who seemed primarily interested in his ability to pick up expensive dinner tabs and weekend trips to Vegas. Every social media post was about some new purchase or exotic experience. When family members expressed concern about his spending, he would get defensive and explain that this was all part of his investment strategy. He was building a lifestyle brand, he said. He was networking with other high-net-worth individuals. You had to spend money to make money. I kept my mouth shut during these conversations, but privately, I was fascinated. I'd started doing my own research into day trading and cryptocurrency investing, not because I wanted to try it myself, but because I wanted to understand what my cousin was actually doing with his money. What I learned was alarming. The strategies he described in his social media posts and family conversations were exactly the kind of high-risk, get-rich-quick approaches that separated amateur investors from their money as quickly as possible. He was essentially gambling, but he'd convinced himself it was sophisticated investing. Update 2. By month 4, the cracks were starting to show. My cousin's social media posts became less frequent and more desperate in tone. Instead of celebrating wins, he was posting angry rants about market manipulation and unfair trading practices. He started promoting various get-rich-quick schemes and cryptocurrency projects that were obvious scams to anyone who'd spent 5 minutes researching them. At my aunt's birthday party, I overheard him on the phone with someone, probably a creditor, explaining that he was between investments and asking for an extension on some kind of payment. When he noticed I was listening, he quickly ended the call and made some excuse about a business deal that was taking longer to finalize than expected. The expensive car was the first thing to go. He explained to the family that he was optimizing his asset allocation, and that luxury cars were depreciating assets anyway. The downtown loft was next. He moved in with a friend temporarily while he waited for the right opportunity in the real estate market. His girlfriend disappeared around the same time as the loft. My cousin explained that she'd gotten a job opportunity in another city, but from the way he said it, it was clear that she'd simply moved on to someone who could still afford to subsidize her lifestyle. The most painful part was watching how he handled the family's growing concern. Instead of admitting he might have made some mistakes, he doubled down on his story about being a sophisticated investor going through a temporary rough patch. He started borrowing money from family members, small amounts at first, just a few hundred here and there for short-term cash flow issues. My parents lent him money. My aunt and uncle lent him money. Even my grandparents on the other side of the family lent him money. Each loan came with a story about an investment that was about to pay off big, or a business deal that was almost finalized, or a cryptocurrency that was about to explode in value. I watched this happening and felt a mixture of fascination and horror. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. Part of me wanted to intervene, to sit him down and force him to face reality, but I also remembered his cruel words at Grandma's funeral. I remembered years of condescension and mockery. I remembered being told to enjoy being poor. So I watched and I waited. Update 3. Month 6 was when everything accelerated. My cousin's friend kicked him out of the spare room, apparently tired of being asked for loans and listening to increasingly frantic phone calls at all hours. My cousin moved back in with his parents, spinning it as a temporary arrangement while he closed some major deals. The family loan stopped being small. He was asking for thousands at a time now, always with increasingly elaborate stories about why he needed the money and how he was going to pay it back with massive returns. Some family members were starting to ask uncomfortable questions about where their previous loans had gone. That's when I learned about the credit cards. Through a combination of family gossip and social media detective work, I pieced together that my cousin had been using credit card cash advances to fund his trading activities. He'd apparently maxed out multiple cards and was using balance transfer offers and new card applications to keep the whole thing going. The day trading had evolved into increasingly desperate gambles. He was putting entire paychecks worth of money into single trades, convinced that one big win would solve all his problems. Of course, each loss just made him more desperate to win it all back. I started getting phone calls from family members asking if I thought they should lend him more money. They knew I worked in finance. Nothing glamorous, just corporate accounting, but enough to understand money better than most of our relatives. I told them honestly that I thought my cousin was in serious financial trouble and that lending him more money would probably just make things worse for everyone. Some of them listened. Others didn't. My cousin's parents remortgaged their house to give him $50,000 for what he promised was a sure-thing investment opportunity. My aunt liquidated her retirement savings to give him $30,000. The saddest part was that they genuinely believed they were helping him, that this was just a temporary setback and their money would help him get back on his feet. By month 7, my cousin had burned through every available source of credit and family money. The elaborate stories about pending business deals had given way to increasingly frantic explanations about market timing and temporary setbacks. He'd started selling his possessions. First the expensive clothes and accessories, then electronics, then anything of value he could find. Final update. Month 8 was when my doorbell rang at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night. I looked through the peephole and saw my cousin standing on my front porch, and he looked like hell. His clothes were wrinkled and dirty. His hair was disheveled, and he was clearly agitated about something. I almost didn't answer the door, but curiosity got the better of me. The moment I opened the door, he started yelling. He was screaming about how I needed to help him, how family was supposed to stick together, how he just needed a small loan to get back on his feet. When I told him I wasn't going to lend him money, he completely lost it. He started ranting about how unfair everything was, how the markets were rigged against small investors, how everyone had betrayed him when he needed them most. Then he started getting personal, bringing up old grievances and family drama from years past. He accused me of being jealous of his success and enjoying watching him struggle. That's when I reminded him of what he'd said to me 8 months earlier. I told him I remembered his advice to enjoy being poor while he enjoyed being rich. I asked him how that was working out for him. The look on his face was something I'll never forget. It was like watching someone realize that their entire worldview had just collapsed. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he started crying. Not just tearing up, but full-on sobbing like a child. He told me everything. How he'd lost the entire inheritance within 6 months through a combination of day trading losses, cryptocurrency scams, and lifestyle inflation. How he'd borrowed against credit cards to try to win it back, and only made things worse. How he'd lied to family members about non-existent investment opportunities to get money from them. How he was now facing bankruptcy and potentially criminal charges for some of the schemes he'd gotten involved with. The $700,000 was completely gone. The family money he'd borrowed was gone. He was facing over $200,000 in debt between credit cards, personal loans from family members, and money he owed to various people he'd gotten involved with in his increasingly desperate investment schemes. But the worst part wasn't the money, it was the relationships. His parents had lost their house. My aunt had lost her retirement savings. Multiple family members had lent him money they couldn't afford to lose, and now they were facing their own financial crises. The family was fractured, with people taking sides and assigning blame for the whole situation. As I stood there listening to my cousin's confession, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction, I won't lie. After years of his condescension and mockery, there was definitely a part of me that enjoyed seeing him brought low. But there was also genuine sadness, not just for him, but for all the family members who had been hurt by his poor decisions. I told my cousin I wouldn't lend him money, but I did offer him something else. I offered to help him figure out a realistic plan for dealing with his debt and rebuilding his life. I offered to help him have honest conversations with family members about what had happened and what could realistically be done to make things right. He turned down my offer. He was still convinced that he just needed one more chance, one more investment opportunity, one more loan to get back on his feet. He couldn't accept that the solution to his problems wasn't more money. It was completely changing his relationship with money. As I watched him walk away from my door that night, I realized that the real tragedy wasn't just the money he'd lost. It was that even after losing everything, he still didn't understand the fundamental lesson that failure was trying to teach him. He was still the same person who had mocked me for being poor, except now he was the poor one and still didn't understand why. The inheritance that was supposed to set him up for life had instead revealed who he really was underneath all the privilege and pretense. And what it revealed wasn't pretty. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done something different, if I could have intervened earlier and prevented some of the damage. But then I remember his cruel words at Grandma's funeral, and I remember that some lessons can only be learned through experience. My cousin had to learn the hard way that money without wisdom is just a countdown timer to disaster. The family eventually recovered, mostly. Some relationships were permanently damaged, and some people lost money they couldn't afford to lose. But everyone learned valuable lessons about trust, family, and the true cost of enabling someone's destructive behavior. As for my cousin, last I heard, he was working at a retail job and living in a studio apartment. He's still convinced that his financial problems are temporary and that he'll find a way to get rich quick eventually. Some people never learn. But I learned something too. I learned that true wealth isn't about having money. It's about understanding money. And I learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply stepping back and letting people destroy themselves with their own poor choices. Sometimes karma doesn't need any help from you. Sometimes it just needs you to get out of the way.